Well, good evening. My name is Paul Maddern, and welcome to the Gala Poetry event of the John Hewitt Society's very first digital festival of literature and ideas, which sadly is replacing what would have been our 33rd international summer school in the city of Armagh in Northern Ireland. But thank you very much for joining us wherever you are in the world tonight or in the afternoon or morning, whatever time it is at your place. Before we begin, I need to thank Poetry Ireland for providing sponsorship for this event, and also the wonderful David Torrance of No Alibis bookstore in Belfast, who is always our bookseller at the festival and is doing the same digitally for us. So he has Mona and Terrence's books for sale. And if you can't get to the shop, David will post them to you. But we should really get on with it. And I'm so excited to be able to present Mona Arshi and Terence Hayes tonight for you. Two poets at different stages of their careers, but both have achieved and are still achieving great things and are admired not only for the beauty and skill and impact of their work, but also for their commitment to poetry as an art form. I'll introduce the poets separately, and Mona will read first for us, followed by Terence. Then there will be a Q&A, and then I'll thank you all. Mona Arshi was born in England of Punjabi Sikh parents and worked previously as a human rights lawyer with the organization Liberty, handling death in custody and asylum detention cases, as well as right to die cases. She began writing poems in 2008 and obtained an MA from the University of East Anglia. During her time there, she won the inaugural Magma Poetry Prize for her poem Hummingbird, and in 2013 placed in the Troubadour Poetry Prize, run by my fellow committee member, Anne-Marie Fife. A year later, she won the Manchester Poetry Prize. In 2015, there was a publication of her debut collection, Small Hands, with Liverpool University Press, which won her the very prestigious Forward Prize for Best First Collection. Her second collection, Dear Big Gods, also with Liverpool University Press, was released in 2019, and it too has been met with widespread acclaim. And a bit of news just in, Mona has had her debut novel, Somebody Loves You, accepted for publication by Other Stories Press, and in the same week that was announced, we learned that Liverpool University has also appointed her Honorary Professor of English and Law. Quite the week. In a beautiful exchange of letters between herself and the poet Liz Berry, published online by the journal Granta, Mona writes that poetry and poetic language are different because we are involved in restlessly interrogating the language and lifting up those stones in the garden when most people look away. I like to think that the whole enterprise is necessarily a counterweight, but that also poetry or song exists and flourishes in the most resistant soil for a reason. And I think that's rather beautiful. And we might come back to some of those ideas as poetry as counterweight, as the interrogation of language, etc., after both parents or poets have read for us. But for now, please, a big cyber welcome for Mona Arshi.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That's such a lovely, fulsome introduction. And Terence, such a pleasure to be reading alongside you. I've followed your work for a number of years, and I'm one of your most ardent fans. So I'm really looking forward to leaning in and listening to your work.
Same.
So I'm going to read from my two collections, Dear Big Gods and Small Hands. And I guess what I wanted to say first off is that I think there's such a deep relationship between the two books, but as I step away from the books or with time, I realise that more and more. I think it was the poet Stanley Kunitz who said that a poem has secrets that the poet knows nothing about. And I think that actually the books have secrets that the poet knows very little about. And I think that I see these books really as sort of siblings. Small Hands was born out of the material of Small Hands was born out of a terrible loss, the loss of my younger brother Deepak, who died whilst I was studying for a master's. And so a lot of the poems in Small Hands are steeped in that grief. And I guess Dear Big Gods although there's a time shift, I think the world of Dear Big Gods, its soil and its weather, if you like, are also concerned with that. So there is a clear relationship between the two books. So I'll start with, and the other thing I wanted to say actually is that because this is with my first book, I was having to deal with quite a difficult personal tragedy, and I was writing from that. There was there's a sort of interrogation throughout a lot of the poems about what can poetry hold, what can a tensile line of a poem hold. And so I think the poem that demonstrates that more than ever, I think, is the poem I read now, which is called Notes Towards an Elegy. Notes Towards an Elegy. 1. Entirely occupied. A million throats migrate towards my ribs, secrete syllables in my chest. All pores and openings have acquiesced. I'm slurring in my sleep. 2. The accumulation of departures, mornings of staring down light. Blame the bend in the trees, blame the abstract, blame my stupid dumb hands. 3. I've forgotten what silence feels like. Tongue loosened with no protest. My other tongue, a ceramic figurine, presses against my teeth. 4. What I know is that I am straining to name the parts, have failed to name the parts of the poem. 5. The back of my hand inscribed with dates, I like the hands of a small bone boy, stirring under the twitching shade of a tree. 6. We found the stumbling bird together and hand-fed her with white bread soaked in milk. We had to leave her by the green shed, and she did die. You noted the delicate integrity of its fretwork. 7. Wait, vast ghost. You should see how the living room is choked with living things, and your mother is upstairs, sitting on your bed, nurturing scraps in the poor light. And this next poem is a terzerima, a sonnet terzerima. The only sonnet terzerima I have ever written and probably will ever write. Chain rhyme. So there's something about chain rhyme that writes for rain. The rain that began elsewhere. I traced a stitch raised by your absence. I concentrated on this panel of sky and wound myself into a ribbon of silence. I've sat at the brink, drafting a lie. I've held my breath, entered the rooms, drawn down the blinds and opened my eyes. I've stood still enough to find my own way home. I died a little when I took tiny sips of spring and spared no thought for when it all had gone. I know all I need to know. I breathe in the shadow scent when it is near and commit it to my own silent skin. I rest on the tilted fence to prepare for rain, the rain that began elsewhere. And this is a poem called Found Thing. It infiltrated, left a trace in my mouth, and I wanted it. Emboldened, it began to colonize all those tight spaces. So I let it bed itself under my fingernails and drip into my tear ducts. It felt so warm, was my constant mute companion, became one of us on sports days, shopping trips, vacations. I never asked any questions, never wished to see its face. One morning it was just not there. I searched and searched, panic rising up in my throat, and I couldn't manage to say what it was I had lost and how. And this is a poem called The Bird. And it came from a dream around the time that my brother died. The bird. She's a prize forager. An assortment of beetle wings are arranged like shiny badges under her bed. Her mealworms have been freeze-dried with such care that they twitch in the bowl when resurrected with just a speck of water. She smells of preening oil, salt, top notes of earth. My mother is turning bird, this tiny impossible thing, perched in my hand, molecules exciting her eyes. Then the soft click, click that unlocks her humanity. She separates from the tips of my fingers, hops to the gap in the window, leaving complex glitter in my palm. And this is a poem from Dear Big Gods, and it's also about my brother, and it's called The Wasp. And it's difficult to explain this poem. It comes from a memory about my younger brother, and in a garden where there was a wasp's nest. And it's funny how you go back to those memories when something terrible happens. And I think everyone's got a wasp memory, but this is a very, very vivid memory that that I kind of kept needing to go back to. The wasps. Suddenly they were on him. He was 10. The cricket game abandoned, but already they drizzled over his limbs, plunging into his ears, his eyes, trying to break into his body. The children stood around him, screaming, stamping them out, though he didn't howl or stagger even. He was shaking his head, moving his arms, swiping in wide semicircles in some horrible dance, just blind panic. Adrenaline. His hair was on fire, his dark boy fringe lit by their frenzy as these maniacal creatures, this colony loaded with pheromones, ruffled round his neck. I was crying, held back by an aunt, till someone brought the hosepipe and drowned them all. His lips were blue, red, swollen, the ball still in the nest. As the sober boy stood dripping into the soil, into their soused bodies, spent. And another poem here is I suppose it's just about language and grief, and the body in grief as well, and sort of how you might envisage what something cool grief might look like, and ransacking her pockets. Like the first morning. I sit at the kitchen table where the light is best, where the light is. As mute as dawn, I blink her out, examine her hands, ink-stained and cold, her neck creaking like an iron hinge cooling on a gate. I search the patch pockets of her dress, full of tiny perforated shells and small yolk-coloured flowers, ruining the lining. And I run my fingers along her back and through her hair, which flows like lava across her pale collarbones. When I flinch, she flinches, this soft girl, this churning, broken song. The poems in Dear Big Gods are bookended by two prayers. And I'll read that last prayer, Dear Big Gods. All you have to do is show yourself. In case you hear us, we are so small and fenceless in the shade. Throw us a hook when you can. Touch the scribbled child in the inferno. All you have to do is show yourself a little. Pin your dark olive green parts against the boulder. And I'll read one small poem, which is the penultimate poem, with a very long title, When Your Brother Steps into Your Piccadilly Westbound Train Carriage. So many times I feel like I've seen him, I've seen my brother, or I've seen like the back of his head, or I've seen his rucksack. So this is one of those poems. You do not stare or question him about the afterlife, those mythical pairs, the balconies, and the how the fuck could you? You could give up your seat, lean forward to touch the hem of his denim shirt, pull gently on his headphone wires, and say, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, a brief interlude. I think I'll do some poems about my daughters. My daughters are now teenagers, but when I first started writing poetry, they wanted me to write about them all the time. And now they're very interesting and they are very reluctant muses. So I kind of have to write about them in a very angular way. So this is a poem about their birth. I have twins, by the way. Delivery room. Having you nearly killed me. The problem with active veins is that I bruise like a peach. My room is shaking. I croak out some intensifiers. Very, absolutely, utterly, totally, like, I am ready to push now. The doctor asks, do you prefer the geometric or lyrical approach? I am open to ideas. Neither, I say. His paisley tie swings like a pendulum over my belly. When pain strikes, it is lilac against the colour of the walls, which are the colour of Nice biscuits. In the milk of my mind, I draw a diagonal line and a perfect horizon. Have you ever ridden a penny farthing? Is that important? Will I still get the morphine? You are presenting very, very posterior. I hear the rest of his team concur. One of them doses out the syringe. The other one is crushing sugared almonds in her teeth. And then another poem about my daughters, which is contained in a poem, which is a ghazal, which many of you hopefully will know. So I love the ghazal. I feel like it's part of my inheritance. My father used to read the ghazal when I was younger, and I'd hear it. I'd never actually see it written down. And the music of the ghazal is something that is tied to kind of abstraction. So it's so different from the sonnet, for example, which has a sort of linear progression, and the ghazal has this kind of circularity. And there's something about the ghazal, actually. It has a sort of, for some reason, it's got a reputation of being sort of twee and beautiful, but actually it is one of the most unrepressed revolutionary forms, because it is totally without any materials in it. It's all about abstracted voice. And also it's the most unrepressed form, I think. So this is ghazal, Darkness. Around the base of the trees amongst the broad oaks, I leave my daughters to ripen in the darkness. Beneath the cunning soul's breath, sweet white snowdrops, their strewn hearts are glowing in the darkness. The soil thanks us. We roll up our cuffs, fill our pocket mouths, defenseless in the darkness. A gentle murmured refrain like old rain, like snowflakes again, we answer to the darkness. I've seen those girls foraging for wild mushrooms, the rim around their retinas turning in the darkness. We plant cloves, tiny armless gods into the loam, poke them deeper into the uncertainty of darkness. My girls are distracted and starved of light, which is normal, which is essence of girl darkness. I slip outside and light a candle, cauterize a bud. Shabash, I call to my girls, my praise in the darkness. And finally, I think I'll read two new poems to you. The first is of the new poems is a poem that I've written during lockdown. And again, I suddenly remembered, it was a memory of the dying Dutch elms when I was younger in my gardens. And also, for some reason, I also remembered my dad, who was a really terrible driver. And we all had to be quiet in his car. And there was something about the fusion of those two things in my memory. This is driving. That summer, we kept quiet in cars. My father hated driving and required silence. So that summer, on short journeys, on motorways, on the back seat, we watched our mouths. At the same time, the elm trees were dying, and ours, the shade-giving mighty elm, quietly ferried the beetle's parasite into its bark. Its leaves flagged and yellowed. Eccentric patterns scarred the trunk. So many trees died, starved quickly after the beetle's first visit. Ours went in a single summer, unnoticed by us, then felled for safety soon after. By the time I was driving, I heard they were breeding elite elms that might resist the pathogens. How carefully I drive now, so like my father, and shame when it comes is powder light, yet heavy as logs, where there's a sharp smell of foxes and a beetle is busy in the twig crotch, scratching out its wretched sound. And the last poem is, actually I'll just take some water. And the last poem is really a poem about souls. So I'm writing a series of poems about souls and who has them, who's entitled to them. Do animals or plants have souls? Anyway, so I can't swim. And a couple of summers ago, I nearly drowned. My children can swim, by the way, very well. And I had to be rescued by one of my 10-year-olds. And so I just remember thinking, this is not my time. This is not my time. So this is Yellows. Last summer was the first time I caught a glimpse of my soul. A daughter had saved me from drowning in a yellow-tiled pool. On the water's surface, a pair of nascent antlers were melting away in the sunlight. I am small, I say, shivering in my towel, bare and humble in my child's arms, my eyes fixed poolside. The second time was on a train, the rapeseed stinging my eyes, that blizzard of yellow. She was resting in the corner of the window, hitched on a bee, dust bathing in pollen. Too soon, not yet, I whispered to the tiny thing, and coward that I am, flipped them both out of the window. Then, on the longest day, a boy was falling. He fell into Richmond, this stowaway, fell into Surrey, and I saw the soul of this boy, the structure, its plumage, parachute out of the plane, dressed in all its paraphernalia. Now I am more circumspect. I rescue petals from teacups, appease wasps at my table, praying they've all repaired themselves fully in the ancient ways, in their yellow frocks, in those scented fields. Thank you again for listening.
Well, Mona, that was wonderful. I forgot to mention that we had you at the John Hewitt Summer School last year, I think it was, and we made a huge impact then in the reading, and this has just gone on to confirm what a wonderful poet you are, and the new work sounds as if you're continuing on and just writing great stuff. It's wonderful. So thank you very, very much indeed. And Terence Hayes, what does one say that's not already been said? He is one of America's leading poets and educators whose work is important both in a literary sense as well as socio-politically, as it speaks to a society dealing with the nuclear fallout, systemic racism, and what it means to be a straight Black man walking through this landscape at this moment in time. His 7 collections to date have met with widespread acclaim and have been rewarded with some of the literary world's top prizes, including a MacArthur Fellowship, National Book Awards, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Pushcart Prize. Terence is also a visual artist, and this aspect of his creative life is equally important to him. As I mentioned, he is also an educator and has taught at Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Pittsburgh, and is currently with New York University. He writes eloquently and passionately about poetry and has championed the work of, amongst others, Etheridge Knight and Wanda Coleman, celebrating them, warts and all. An attitude I see reflected in his own work, where rarely is anything purely perfect or purely imperfect. If the volta in a sonnet provides the turn, so too does Terence's work, making us look afresh at attitudes and perceptions we have hitherto taken for granted, or indeed never before considered. American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin, his most recent collection, was nominated for the T.S. Eliot Prize over on this side of the Atlantic and has, like Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American lyric, had an impact internationally, foregrounding both overt and micro-racist attitudes, leading many of us to question white liberal inaction, as well as to inspire resistance against far-right extremism. His work, like Rankine's, is having a profound influence on emerging writers here in Ireland, looking for new literary role models as we venture into this new century and confront an increasingly hostile environment. Being shortlisted for the Eliot no doubt brought Terence to a wider audience here, but it is our great pleasure at the Hewitt Society to introduce him, we hope, to new readers and undoubtedly to new admirers. Please welcome Terrance Hayes.
Well, hey, everybody. It's really good to be here. Mona, those poems are wonderful. I'm glad we're going to have a Q&A so we can talk a little bit about, especially that guzzle and the form, which I agree. Everything you said about that form is true. But what I have really been working out in a general sense is just how to make this, make the best of this format, this Zoom format for readings. So I have been using it as an opportunity to show some of the ways that drawing is always in conversation with the poems for me. But more broadly speaking, how image is in conversation with language across the work. And so I think you'll see that. I just want to kind of set that up for you. I have some stuff here. I'm actually just going to kind of watch the watch. There's a video at the end. So I think I'm just going to see what I can get through up until about, for the first 15 minutes. And then we'll finish up with that video, which is about maybe 3 minutes. So I'm going to get right to it and just say, as I have been thinking about this, it occurred to me that even as early as Lighthead in 2010, I was thinking about what I could do with words and images. And so in that book, there are 4 sequential poems called the Pechakucha, which is actually based on a PowerPoint form, a form of showing 20 images, 20 seconds each, and then people sort of riffing and talking about them. Architects and graphic designers typically would use it. So I used that form to write those poems, never thinking I would have the opportunity to actually show people the images that I was riffing on. So I want to read this poem, which again is a Pechakucha. I dug up the images and have put it in its original format, which is the PowerPoint form. I only say, I thought about this particular poem because I just found out a couple of days ago that my father died, my biological father. And so this is the only time I met him, some of the things that happened in this poem. And so I thought, it's a way to send him a shout. He passed away last June, apparently, this past June, apparently. But it also led me to this, again, another way of thinking about making the best of this format. So I'm essentially going to show you this Pechakucha with the images that initially inspired it, that don't show up in the book. And then from there, you'll see how this conversation continues for me, even in my own work. And then we can talk and then get started. So yeah, essentially that's it, Arbor for Butch and other poems and pictures. And so we can talk about these things and in whatever manner you want, but I'm just going to dash through them and then we can see what happens. So this is Arbor for Butch from Lighthead. As I said, when I wrote the poem, I was looking at these images by this sculptor, Martin Perrier. And so I'm happy to try this with those images. Arbor for Butch. Vessel. I am with my newborn son and the man blood says is my father in a shit motel. And if each of us is, as I sometimes believe, the room we inhabit, he is a bed used until it's stained. Even if I knew this first meeting was our last, I would have nothing to offer beyond the life I have made without him. Thicket. In the far south, where history shades everything, there are people who fear trees. I once heard an old man say, I may be black as a crow, but I'm white inside. Nowhere else does the sky do what the sky does there, where the graves are filled with dirt, the color of fire. We drank whiskey until we were drunk as the couple in the photo my mother gave me to show him, the boy and girl swaying at the edge of my future. I watched my father curl on the bed like a leaf drained of its greening as my child cried the way rain cries when it's changed to steam. Because I believe the tree is a symbol of everything, one of us was the bough, reaching across the road as fumes scorched its leaves. One of us was a door opening and closing in the darkness. One of us was a boat being carried downstream. My father and I sat in a motel room beside a highway, where his pickup was the shade of a bruise beneath the glow of the vacancy sign, where he and his talk began to evaporate. We were two fathers watching the faces of two sons, where the evening passed as it arrived. Where the rain comes long-toed and crushing the high grass, swamping the land, where a slave talked his children out of running away with the bottom of his shoe. This is what it means to believe in ascension and fear climbing. In the far south, where sap jewels the bark, the teeth of the saws are sticky and bittersweet. But I wanted to carve a door out of the wood, and around that door, I wanted to build a room because I knew what my mother wished for, and I knew from far off what she would need. The arm of the boy falls around the girl, heavy as a branch in the photograph, with the gloss that's been rubbed clean, and the blurred inscription, which nearly delivers its message before vanishing. I drove the long night to see the face my son and I wear like a mask. Where history can be a downpour of joy and guilt spilling its wrong-headed desire all over the body. Where a boy and a girl fought in a motel bed to make me, one desire beating against another. Where my mother seemed to blur, calling him her first lover, even after she said she was raped. In the far south, my father, the first time I met him, said, God made nothing sweeter than pussy. We smoked our history. We drank to our future until each of us was a head of steam, clouds above each other's dreams. Where the plan was, when I saw him, to cut off his hands. Where because of this man, my mother would want me dead, would want no limbs to branch inside her, no cluster of sound waiting in a drum. Where she wanted to, but could not shape her want into an axe. Sometimes my body is a guitar, a hole waiting in wood, wires trembling to sleep. To identify what you are, to be loved by what you identify. I thought this is how the blood sings into the self. I thought what was hollow in me would be shaped into music. The first time I met my father, I believed I would understand the line connecting me to him, because a man rooted to his kin can never be a slave. But he was like the road, skid-marked and distant, like the rain breaking above ground and beating into it. In the far south, whereas one man swung from the limb of a tree, he said, I may be black as this bark, but my heart is light. Where even when your lantern burns out, they say the flame lasts. Where everyone I know is ablaze with this story and darkened by its ash. Certain arrangements must be made if you want access to the past. With his rooms without rooms and his truck without gas, my father was a nail bent into the shaft of a hammer, a wound the length of a kiss, a mouth bled of its power. I am with the ones the blood says are mine. And if each of us is, as I sometimes believe, little more than a bray of nostalgia, we are like the village mule chained to its muling. My father fit a slim, ragged hand over the head of my newborn son and said, "He sounds like a white child crying like that." What if blackness is a fad? Dear negritude, I live as you live, waiting to be better than I am. Before sleep last night, I thought how it would be to awaken with all the colors of this world turned inside out. And that was the name of my suffering. The story my father told me did not reveal one body inside another, the arms of the boy who would become my father embracing the girl who would become my mother. It did not hold the sentence rooted to the beginning of my life. I am not doing anything now, except waiting like a bird who uses the bones and feathers of other birds to build its nest. I am on my bed of leaves, thinking about the past, how my father dragged his shadow across the room the way a storm drags its rain, where there were too many trees and too many names etched into the trunks, where the knots in the wood were the scars of old limbs, where, to be born, the birch pine must be set aflame, where the door, if I opened it, would have revealed the lovemaking or abuse still waiting to be named. So even in How to Be Drawn, which I hope the name sort of says, how that book too was an opportunity for me, or an exploration of image. So there's photographs, but again, you know, in the world in which I wrote that book, I wasn't ever thinking about a chance to show you guys some of the stuff that happens around these poems. So this drawing, which actually I included in the Wicked Enchantment Selected Poems of Wanda Coleman, which I edited earlier this year. So this is inside the book. But I drawn it, you know, because this is sort of how I spend my time thinking about things. And so in that book, How to Be Drawn, I was certainly mostly meditating on this question of how to draw things out. And the shortest poem in the book, and the poem that I, didn't think it would lead to where it led, was this poem for Wanda Coleman. So it's called American Sonnet for Wanda C. And I read it because it's sort of in the DNA of the book to follow. I essentially kept running with this idea, so much so that I, in some ways, moved away from this drawing thing. So after I get through this one, I'll show you some more recent things and we'll be done. So this is in How to Be Drawn. For Wanda, American Sonnet for Wanda C., who I know knows why all those lush-boned, worn-out girls are whooping where the moon should be, an eyelid clamped on its lightness. Nobody sees her without the hoops firing in her ears because nobody sees. Tattooed across her chest, she claims, is "Bring me to where my blood runs." And I want that to be here, where I am her son, pent in blackness and turning the night's calm loose and letting the same blood fire through me. In her balm hair, shells full of thunder. In her mouth, the fingers of some calamity, somebody foolish enough to love her foolishly. Those who could hear no music weren't listening. And when I say it, it's like claiming she's an elegy. It rhymes because of her with effigy. Because of her, if there is no smoke, there is no party. I think of you, Miss Calamity, every Sunday. I think of you on Monday. I think of you hurling hurt where the moon should be and stomping into our darkness calmly. So this is just the poem on the back of the American Sonnets. And I put it there to sort of frame the poems. It's actually the only poem I'm going to read from the sonnet. But you see in the corner there, that drawing was just me playing around with like, what would a music box and meat grinder look like, and trying to make the notes like wings or something. So again, we can talk about some of that. Like, I don't actually have anything really to say about what this stuff is, other than like, it's great to be able to share it with you. So I'll read this poem, a couple more, and we'll be done. American Sonnet for my past and future assassin. I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room in a house set aflame. I lock you in a form that is part music box, part meat grinder to separate the song of the bird from the bone. I lock your persona in a dream-inducing sleeper hold while your better selves watch from the bleachers. I make you both Jim and Crow here. As the Crow, you undergo a beautiful catharsis trapped one night in the shadows of the Jim. As the Jim, the feel of crow shit dropping to your floors is not unlike the stars falling from the pep rally posters on your walls. I make you a box of darkness with a bird in its heart. Voltas of acoustic, instinct, and metaphor. It is not enough to love you. It is not enough to want you destroyed. Looks like I have just a couple more minutes here. So I think I'm just going to read one more poem before the video. So I'll pass that one, which is just an example of me continuing to try to write these things occasionally. And what I will do here again is show you, like, this is just something I wrote in May for someone who was graduating from college. And I was like, well, I'll use it as a chance to write a poem. I'm holed up here. So I'm doing all kinds of things in it, playing around with May. But I also I'd been sort of drawing these little maps on my iPad. I can't explain them again, but I decided to try, almost like what I was doing in that initial Pechacucha, to see what kinds of things would come if I looked at those images while trying to write this poem. So read this one, I'll show you this video and we can talk. So this one's called A Map of States for a solo at graduation. A map indicating the state of the Union may yield the statues, static, and statutes of grave white men, while a map indicating disrepair may yield colorful groundbreakers uprooting graves. A map indicating the state of your affairs may include only the business of your accountant if you are able to steer clear of laissez-faire. Maybe let's not talk. Maybe let's not take that road down the mountain. A map indicating states of arousal may also be a map few people find useful, though the people who feel this way may also be people in a state of denial. A map indicating a state of inertia may be indistinguishable from a map indicating a state of flux. The route may lead you in circles around the map. A map indicating a state of the art may feature what could be mistaken for peace signs or tiny wheels making their way across a larger map that may indicate a state of grace under fire, or may indicate a state of emergency exit, a route which may divide at forks in the road or may multiply at crossroads, leading you out into a light so bright and constant you may have to wear a cap and shades indoors, like brothers who know as much about Maybachs as Bach pursuing cultural studies or the mother tongue of New York. They may wear peace signs on their shoulders, traveling states of aggression that may actually be states of preservation or distress. A map indicating a state of war may actually be a map indicating a state of weariness. Let your eyes fall where they may on the map indicating your state. Wander the states of wonder indicated by the many unmarked areas along the map. Almost anything you see is a map in some way. Let your eyes fall where they may on the maps. And this final poem I did, it's kind of a visual poem. It's actually going in the other direction because I had written the poem and sent it to a friend who was doing a documentary on Watch Night, which is sort of precursor to Juneteenth, in terms of like emancipation in the 1800s, the end of the Civil War. And so when June rolled around, I just pulled that documentary up again, and I pretty much just cut out everything. It was a 12-minute documentary, and I cut out everything but the poem and strung this together for a Juneteenth reading that I was giving. Again, just wanting to figure out how to give people something more to do than just sort of look at my face. So hopefully it'll work. Sometimes it's a little slow in inside the keynote. So if it does that, I'll stop and open up another window. But let's see what happens.
An extended public service announcement. Mark your calendars now, brothers and sisters, for end of the year watch night services in the area. Spend twilight to midnight in a house with a pulpit of pews and atmospheric fellowship. If you are lost as a child's muddy shoe beside an anxious river, if water gathers beneath your nails when you touch it, get free of the twisted root. Some night, it may be freedom's eve again. You may find yourself in a room somewhere in the near past or distant future awaiting Lincoln's decree. Upon the proclamation, two contests of resistance may ensue, like two troubled storms making a violent path to the sea. You may dress like a worshiper in the bowels of a warship made of animal and forest parts. You may quench your thirst with the rain on your lashes. You may dress like the woman who scours the schoolhouse until it is clean enough for church. The room may have been built according to the architecture of farmers and teachers dressed as slaves. After several hours working for the nothings of enslavers, Black people raised the scaffolding of holy shelters in the dark. Someone may have slaughtered and prepared the cow that provided the hide for the preacher's Bible. Someone may have smuggled raw cotton from the field and later worked it until it was useful cloth. The cross may be made of blacksmith scraps, or a master carpenter's timber, or two bound branches with a few almost imperceptible buds opening along the bark. You may be asked to wash the hands of an enemy. You may begin the night with your fist in knots of strong opposition and end it with your palms fanning your awe in woozy light. You may hear tales of the hour the state upgraded Black folk from property to slightly more free. You may fall in love with a good listener. Find food and drink in the cafeteria. A visitor such as yourself, sequestered an entire year in America, may find your name turns to music when spoken on watch night. If you feel like a tourist in a war-torn country, come figure it out with us. Area churches welcome you to service. Mother Emanuel, New Horizons, Macedonia, Bridge of Life, Heaven's Door. Visitors welcome to churches featuring street names and whereabouts, the names of saints, apostles, angels, kings, and servants, names featuring charity, restoration, faith. First African is not far from Second African. The Chapel of Redemption is between the House of Conviction and the Temple of Forgiveness. There's a great organist at the Shepherd's Tabernacle. The 8th Avenue Church of Eve's Destiny is across the street from the 8th Avenue Church of Adam's Redemption. 100-year-old twins sing at the Olive Branch House of Holiness in Christ. The list of services is not exhaustive. Cancellation never happens. This is a public service announcement. Mark your calendars. Tomorrow loves you. Join us or contact us, and we will spread the word if your place of worship has watch night plans.
So, okay, I think that's everything I got for y'all. Looking forward to the conversation and glad I got to try this out.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Terrance. I mean, we were talking as a committee, John Hewitt, we were talking about whether or not to do anything at all this year in terms of a festival online or whatever. And some of us were thinking, well, maybe let's just leave it for this year and move on. Then we started thinking, it provides an opportunity for us to do things that we haven't been able to do in the past. We're a charity, we haven't got that much money. So inviting you, for example, to read for us is something we couldn't have done possibly otherwise, digitally. And there are opportunities that the digital format provides that normal reading venues don't offer. And what you've given us tonight is an example of of the possibilities of what you can do with the format. to sort of change it up a little bit and provide a different kind of reading. And it's very much appreciated. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
I sent you in an email, I sent you a quote by the wonderful Dennis O'Driscoll, who was a very much loved poet and poetry critic over here in Ireland, and died just a few months before Seamus. And Seamus actually delivered his eulogy. It was a lovely, lovely service, actually. But I've used this quote on many occasions because I just think it says so much about poetry and what it can and what it aims to do. So I'm going to start by reading this, and then we can take it from there. So Dennis O'Driscoll writes, "Since words are spoken by everyone, the custody of language is a sufficient responsibility itself for a poet. To inscribe in language some hitherto unexpressed area of experience, to fill in some blank corner of the human canvas is worthwhile. To speak the small truths that feed into the bigger truth. Also, the aspiration of poetry is always towards the creation of something permanent in language. In our era of the disposable, the ephemeral, this is countercultural, as indeed is the fact that genuine poetry transcends the blinkered vision of the journalistic present. It inhabits the present, but it is also very much in dialogue with the inherited forms and great voices of the past." And that's from a collection of his essays, Troubled Thoughts, Majestic Dreams, published by Gallery Press. Now, in interviews I've read with you guys, either online or in print, you talk about yourselves just as writers, living your day, your daily life, and recording that life as it is lived by you in the world. And there's a lovely sort of no-nonsense journalistic aspect to that. There's no airs and graces, no occupation of some rarefied space as such. But you also both very clearly think deeply about what poetry, capital poetry, the poetry is, what a poem is and how they're produced. And do you think there's a sense for every poet that's worth a damn that there's a balancing act between just living and recording that life and thinking about what it means to be a poet, to think about the journalistic present, but how as a writer you might transcend that as well?
Gosh, that's a really
I just thought I'd go in light. I'd start
it's
off
really,
light.
really, so I love that quote, and it's such a really interesting question. And I love the idea of the countercultural, because for me, poetry sits in this zone, and the zone is different to any other kind of text or genre. It is other. And the offness of it, actually, the offness of the language of poetry, I think is its kind of power for me. I mean, for me, it's like, well, it's where the humane and the human rest, in poetry. So I also think there's something else actually that I probably want to say, which is that not only that, but I think in a way it's the democracy of a poem, the kind of that I feel very strongly, because it is the most participatory thing that you can have. You have to step into a poem, you have to encounter a poem, you have to feel a poem, and so much of everything else that we do in our lives is counter to that. And I was talking about the ghazal earlier about the abstraction and the lack of materiality. I mean, so those sorts of themes are really interesting to me. And actually, Terence, in your wonderful The Arbor for Birch, it was very interesting because you have they're almost like windows, the poems, they're acting like windows. So all these windows are flung open. Plus you have the images that are proliferating the whole time. And there's a real active listening at the same time as the visual going on, which is a really good example of that participation. I mean, and I can't think, I used to be a human rights lawyer, and I dealt with, legal kind of quite dead text. So where I am is kind of the opposite of that. So I don't know how you feel, Terence, but that's how I feel that's why I'm in it, really, for that, because it is totally counter to everything else.
I agree with all of that. I want to say about that quote, which is really magnificent. I just love the notion of the custody of language, that particular word for what that looks like, which is we're trying to wrestle this organic, impossible, ubiquitous subject. And I do think of language like, a painter thinks of paint, or a musician thinks of music. So it is a substance that everyone has, which I think he's applying in. But I want to bridge that to the guzzle, because at the end of that comment of like this kind of past and future dynamic that Driscoll mentions at the end of that is how I think of the guzzle. I was just meditating on it the other day. I came across a good one. I don't know if it was as good as the Guzzle for Darkness. That was extremely lyric. But when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, rigor and improvisation, those are the two things. There's just not that many forms that give you that. I mean, Wanda Coleman gives me a window into something like that in the American sonnets. But the sonnet is not implicitly a space for improvisation, I don't think. Very few forms are, except for the guzzle. And the other thing about that dynamic, which leads us back to Driscoll's quote about past and present, is that this is what Agha Shahid Ali, the late poet, said. He also was the one who told everybody it was the guzzle and not the hustle. And I keep hearing people say it different ways, but he said guzzle, so that's what I say. But it's this idea of like reaching back, a respect for tradition. How about that? A respect for some notional rules. So whether it's that refrain or the internal rhyme or mentioning your name in it, but you kind of have to do that, because if you don't, it's, it's anarchy. It's not the form. So he was irritated about that dynamic. But then there's this other side that goes back to the abstract, which is like, even inside of that, the rigors of a kind of traditional form, you're still reaching for like, I was like, I couldn't come up with the phrase, like intrinsic spiritual freedom, imaginative possibilities. These are the things that happen when you have to engage that refrain. So you're sort of dancing, and at the end of it, that's what I said. Just like, and this is for nobody. It's just me making notes. Like, dancing through the eye of a needle is how I would describe that guzzle form, because it is really great for that. Again, that rigor and improvisation. So it's so great that you brought that up, because I was just thinking something like that.
That's so interesting. It's so wonderful to be able to have this discussion about the guzzle. And I think Shahid Ali said it was, if you didn't follow the spirit or 9/10 of the kind of tradition, I think he said it was a bastard. I think he said these are bastard forms. If you're not, I mean, I don't know him, but I know people that have been taught by him. But I mean, he was very clear that he would take the gift back. And I like that, idea of like, well, the severity of that almost, actually, because in a way the guzzle looks as if it's not that difficult. It belies that, and actually, because it's not very logical. Right. But of course, it's wedded to the music, which enslaves you.
It's just a great metaphor for poems, because I think people approach poems similarly as like not that difficult until you get into this wrestle between, again, what is a kind of formal constraint and what is freedom inside of the poem. So yeah, it's good for all of those kinds of things. I mean, I guess I'll say too, I mean, this is sort of looped to some of the questions that will come about process. I do like the notion of a bastard. I mean, that Arbor for Butch is saying, I'm very comfortable with the bastard notion. So even in the sonnet form, I think of like the way we bend those rules inside of the rules is where all the fun happens. And so any kind of crossbreeding is always appealing to me.
I also think that, and I know you're, very interested in form and revitalizing the sonnet, but I think that if we don't have I think the forms will die if we don't sort of play with them. And actually, who owns form? There's a kind of other relationship with that. I mean, I love form. I kind of feel like it's, for me, it's part of like your imaginative obligation, just as it is when you are thinking about all the other things that make up a poem. You have to think, isn't there an imaginative obligation to think about whether you've used the right form, and then you don't know that until you know the forms, but I'm really interested, Terence, as to what, and I know that you've spoken about this in interviews, but the sonnet itself, this archaic kind of ancient form, what is it about that form for you that really that made you write a whole book about it?
Well, the easy answer would be throughout Wanda Coleman's career, she'd been writing these American sonnets, and in a few places she sort of defined them. So metaphorically, that just means that every poet, I think, is just like a rite of passage. That doesn't mean every poet publishes their sonnets, but I think every poet must at some point encounter it because of its deep history. So that's the first thing. So then I started teaching her poems for many years, the American sonnets, and I would give an assignment to the students, which is to say, so Wanda Coleman has come up with these definitions, and of course, she's altering it by that adjective, American sonnet, which makes sense because there's Shakespearean/English sonnet, there's Petrarchan sonnets, there's a Miltonic sonnet, even Gerard Manley Hopkins has a kind of sonnet. So clearly, the adjective you put in front of the word sonnet gives you a lot of insight to how you might address it. So I just would say to my students, what would your American sonnet be? And then, what would those rules be? Would it be 14 lines? Maybe not. And then some of hers are 15 lines, in fact. So I would just say, it grows both out of needing a response, some kind of container to put all of the energy and gravity I was feeling when Donald Trump got elected. And it is inherently how I feel about form, again, is just sort of seeing what I can do inside of those constraints, how I can bend those constraints, how I can get around them while also engaging them.
So something that sort of was touched on tangentially there. I know Mimi Calvetti had a huge influence on you, Mona, and she's a practitioner of the ghazal, of course, and I would imagine that was a bit of an influence on you in that regard. And Terence also talks about this thing called liquid poetics, and the influences of poets on us, living and past, and how it is a sort of a liquid, fluid movement between the past and the present, and how we produce our own goods in the end, if you like. Did you want to speak a little bit about how there have been influences on your life in terms of those writers? I know obviously that Etheridge Knight and Coleman have been influences on you. Are there particular influences on you, Mona, that have led you in certain directions as a writer?
Yeah, I think that my reading has always been around kind of the lyric poetry. And I guess because I was steeped in the ghazal at an early age, I was very aware of the kind of poetics, the Eastern poetics of writing in that tradition. So, and I feel as if I feel like I still want to write in those traditions. But I also, when I started reading seriously, was reading a lot of Eastern European poetry. People like Wisława Szymborska have been has had a huge impact on me, her writing. And I also have tried to read translations as much as possible. So for a long, long time, I've tried to read in translation. So the Punjabi and Urdu are my mother tongue. Actually, Punjabi I'm pretty fluent in, and so it gives you access to other writers, which is sort of really lovely. But I also feel that most of the time I end up wanting to find stuff that can contain some of my experience, and I started sort of writing poetry later than most because I had a career as a human rights lawyer, but I was very much wanting to read that. So my initial reading was people like Maniza Alvi, and then Mimi Calvetti. When I found her, I sought her out, and she became my mentor, and now is a really good friend, and is been a huge influence in trying to think about how to think about music in the work as well, which is an ear and being attentive to the ear. So I always think that when you write a poem, there's at the door of your poem, at the door of your subconscious, there's another poet, a dead poet or somebody else who's knocking at that door in some way. I always feel that. I feel like there's a third, there's you and the poem, and then there's a third. There's a sort of triangulation going on when you're writing, and I feel that quite strongly actually when I'm in a poem.
My response is always like, the question is like, who haven't you read? My ambition is to be influenced by everyone. But what that generally means when I think about like the sort of my process is it's almost like moving from a river into the sea. So what that means is in the early years, if I had less knowledge of the great history and breadth of poetry. I was struck by Yusuf Komunyakaa, Larry Levis, kind of expansive poet. But I would go back to that and say, like, even in high school, I was making decisions. So I think I liked Jean Toomer more than Langston Hughes. I liked Walt Whitman more than Emily Dickinson. But as I got older, that just meant that I was going to go back and investigate those as sort of blind spots in terms of one's growth, in terms of one's maturity. So I say again, I hope everybody's an influence, really. I try to think about the people I don't like so that I could go back to them at this point. And that's probably been true for about 10 years. But that is the image. You just want your influence to be about as deep and as broad and boundless as a river moving out towards the sea. So you should always be looking for influences. I don't think it stops. And I totally agree that they're always at the door. You mean, you hope as many people as possible are at the door and at the window, helping you build this house of poetry, this boat of poetry, whatever, this craft of poetry.
One sort of realm of influence is, especially more and more these days, happens as a result of creative writing courses within the academy. Personally, I found and formed great friends within that, and the companionship within that has certainly helped me as a writer to think about what I'm doing as a writer and where I might be heading, and to also be jealous a little bit of, what someone else has written in a workshop, and I think, I have to raise the bar. I have to do something. Next week I have to bring in a poem that's as good or in response or something. And we've remained friends, and it's been a wonderfully productive atmosphere within the creative writing community. And that's very much the plus side, I think, of creative writing courses. One thing, and I know you're both involved in teaching, one of the things that I worry about a little bit, and I ask this because you've had so many different experiences in life and then come to writing and still live, as I said, that sort of, you walk through life and write about it. One thing that concerns me about creative writing courses is kids doing their BA, their MA or MFA, PhD, boom, 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 one after another, and not being out there in the big wide world and having a life. Do you find that that's something that needs to be addressed within these courses?
Shall I say something?
Yeah, you probably teach more than I do.
Well, you know what? What I'm going to say is, when I'm advocating for ex-convict poet like Etheridge Knight or Wanda Coleman, who was like, divorced mother, married, remarried. She was like a bartender. She was a screenwriter. When I'm advocating for those folks, and another poet that I was doing like these drawings, and I thought I might share something, but I didn't have it at the time, of like Linda Hall, who is this poet who is a white woman born in New Jersey who loved jazz. She only wrote 3 books before she died. She struggled with, heroin addiction throughout her life. So the thing that all 3 of them share is that they were never really securely in the university, but they were poets. They were still poets. And I say Linda last because I'm not actually suggesting that, the path that she went down necessarily was poor, but it is to suggest that you do find poets all over the place. And I think that's always true. So what I talk to my students about, both in their activism, but also in their poems themselves, is to be looking for people who aren't doing what they're doing. So that's no critique of what they're doing. If they come to the university, whenever they come, it is just to say, like, this is not the only way to be a poet. But if you look at me and if you look at most of your teachers, you might assume that it is, that you have to teach. And I sort of am always thinking about those poets who are too bad, too misbehaving, too troubled, too honest. Even that's how I think about Wanda Coleman. She just didn't hold her tongue for anybody. So I guess that's my response. I mean, I am in the university and I love the students that I have, but I'm always just reminding them there's so many ways to be a poet, to sustain yourself. And like, even one book, this is what I say about Neruda, saying this to someone who wanted to talk to him once, saying like, anybody can write a book. Every Chilean's got one book. So suggesting that there's something more complicated to being a poet than just having an MFA degree, even if they come through for it.
I think we're probably getting towards the end of our time, really. But maybe we should talk about what is in the future for you, what you've been working on. Mona, there's your novel, of course. Terrance, you've sort of given us a little glimpse of other things. Is there a major project in the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is really short. I think I just said it. I just try to write the next poem. I haven't even really been sending a bunch of stuff out. I sent a couple of poems out like last month, but my real attitude, especially in this particular world, is just to kind of put my mind into the next poem. And then, so that's pretty much as far as I go. I have been doing, as I said, lots of drawing. So that kind of May poem is just sort of one example of that. But again, it just came out of somebody getting ready to graduate. So I sort of take the poems wherever they show up, and whatever that means for like what a book will look like. I'll wait and see. I think I'll think about that when everybody's head is a little bit more above water. But right now, I'm just trying to write to survive, I think.
There's a lot to write about at the moment, that's for sure. And Mona?
I think the same. I'm trying not to think too far ahead, actually. I wrote these two books very, very close together. And I feel like I need to, I don't really think I have a lot to say at the moment, to be honest with you. I feel conflicted. I feel like I have a lot to say and not a lot to say at the same time. But I think what that means is that sometimes there needs to be time between the experience and writing. And I think that's what's happening with the poems. And in terms of the novel, there is a novel, but I feel like I have tricked myself into writing. I'm a poet that has tricked herself into writing this novel, which is a very, 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 very poetic novel. And I think it's actually a lot of the same themes that are in the books around families, about violence in families and empathy and loss, all rubbing up against each other in a voice, really, is sort of what I've been working on. And I didn't even know what it was until I took the pulse of it, and then thought, oh, actually, it's probably a novel. It could have been a poem, but it ended up being a novel. So
thank you both very, very much indeed for taking part in this. It's been a real pleasure for me, honestly. It's been a great privilege, and I've enjoyed it immensely. I hope you've gotten something.
Really, Terence. Well. Those poems are so phenomenal. I got a real hit out of just hearing them and actually seeing those images at the same time. I thought it worked incredibly well. So thank you.
Great to be with you today, all of y'all.
And before we go, just to thank you to those who've actually registered and watching, who are watching this. And we hope in the near future, next year possibly, that we can be with you live in auditoriums and parks and small cafes and dark rooms, wherever, just to enjoy the face-to-face encounters with writers and artists and performers. Thank you for coming and listening to us tonight. And thank you too to Mona and Terrance. It's been a great, wonderful evening.
Thank you.